And initially, just recently, I don't mind myself because the one that was a big turbine, something a gentleman, I don't think they allowed it. And Barack, that's all. That's all. You'll hear Twitter, you'll hear Twitter. 841 738. I prefer 7.
Welcome. Does this work? I think it is. Welcome. I'm delighted that you've all come to this first Berkeley of our Berkeley Writers at Work series for this year. I'm also particularly delighted to welcome you into the reopened Morrison Room. This is the first time I've been in it since it was closed for the seismic strengthening of the library, and it's the ideal room to have this series in. One of the things that we share as a community is that we're all writers. And writing is both a very public thing and a very private thing. It's a very public thing because as soon as you have committed something to print, everyone in the world can, if they buy or borrow it, read it. But I think it's very private in the kinds of habits that each of us has as a writer, whether we write on a computer, on a typewriter, I suppose there aren't very many of those left, or with a pencil and paper, as I still do. What kind of pencil, what kind of pen, what kind of paper? How much do you write before you start to revise? How polished do you demand something is before you move on? When do you revise? How much do you revise? When do you first show what you've written to someone? All of these things I think are very personal and private, parts of how we all write. Well, this has been a wonderful series, and the ones that I've had the privilege of hearing of how some of our faculty write. And to introduce Alan Dundes, who's the faculty member that you're going to be hearing today, I'm going to introduce Carolyn Porter, who is the Dean of Undergraduate and Interdisciplinary Studies, and also a colleague of mine in English and a wonderful writer herself, who has been energetic and imaginative in her support of writing programs on this campus. So, Carolyn.
Thank you, Carol. It is a great pleasure to be here today and also to re-inhabit this wonderful room. The Alumni House is nice. This could be upgraded, I think. I'm also especially pleased to be here to introduce Professor Alan Dundes, who is, I think it's fair to say, the nation's foremost folklorist. Professor Dundes is a professor of anthropology and folklore here at Berkeley. He received his bachelor's degree, I'm happy to say, in English. That's why he writes well. From Yale, and his PhD in folklore from Indiana University. He's the author of over 200 articles, 10 books, and another 20 or so for which he is the co-author or editor. It is remarkable to write so much. It is daunting. It is intimidating. Not only has he written a great deal, he's written on virtually everything, it seems like. If you look at your program, you'll see you should emphasize selected on the list of publications, but even the selected list gives you some flavor of the heterogeneity of Professor Dundes' interest in scholarship. He's written on subjects ranging from jokes to games and war, to North American Indian folk tales, to the German national character, to U.S. presidents, and most recently, vampires. A colleague has called him an acknowledged giant in the field. I think we could fairly say he is the acknowledged giant in the field. His 1997 book, Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow, a Freudian folkloristic essay on caste and untouchability, from which there's a wonderful quotation in your program, has been much praised and is, like many of his publications, both provocative and controversial. One of the great things about being a very fine writer is that you make clear those things that seem very opaque to the general reader. He is a past master at making things lucid that most of us would find very difficult to understand. And I think along with that goes the controversiality and provocativeness of his writing, so that people don't always agree with him. But a reviewer of this latest book has commented that even those who disagree with his assertions will find that his essays provocative. I think that's a certainty. I would like to add, I mean, one of the more recent, one of the 20 books plus that he's co-edited that is very famous and well known and often cited, he compiled with Carl Pachter a book on urban folklore from the paperwork empire, including stories and jokes that people pass on by office copier, fax, email, and business cards. So this augurs well, because I presume that if he hadn't studied the paperwork empire, he is primed to study the post-paperwork empire that we're now about to launch into. It is no surprise, given all these accomplishments, though it is by no means always true of someone with this kind of record as a scholar. But in Professor Dundes' case, it's no surprise that he's also the winner of a UC Berkeley Distinguished Teaching Award, which is an extraordinarily high honor indeed. I want to introduce Professor Dundes. I also want to introduce Steve Tollefson, who will be conducting the interview, who is, in his own way, just as impressive a figure, also a winner of the Distinguished Teaching Award, and a person whose commitment to helping all of us write better is so profound that he is one of the few people on this campus whose absence, I think, would be felt sort of like an earthquake. So I take great pleasure in introducing both of these distinguished speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for those kind words. I want to thank some people before I read. I want to thank Carol Christ, not only for gracing us with her presence, but also to publicly commend her for the incredible job she's done as really one of the top administrative officials on the campus. She's been a terrific inspiration for the campus and has kept us on track. And Carolyn Porter, I know in other roles as sharing students together, and she's also done a wonderful job in the writing program. And Steve Tollefson I've known for a while, and he's responsible for the orchestration of today's event, but also he was involved in the teaching award as well, and he is one of the great, I think, unsung heroes here. I also want to thank my department for putting up with me for all these years. I want to thank my wife, Carolyn, who's here, and besides taking all the thuses out of my writing, has been my best friend, my most severe critic, and life's companion, and she has provided the kind of environment that has made it possible for me to do a lot of these research projects. I also want to thank my children who are not here, Allison at USC in political science, Associate Professor Lauren is at the Western Maryland in sociology, and David has risen to the ranks in Wells Fargo. And the reason I want to thank them is that some of my projects, as Carol indicated, are controversial, particularly the thing like with football being homoerotic ritual and getting into the end zone more times than they get into your end zone, that sort of thing. So that the kids, even now, after they're grown up, will often ask their mother on the phone, "What's Dad working on now?" Because they get some flack from they got it when they were students at Berkeley, but now in their other roles, they get some flack when I get too outrageous. So I must also thank them. And lastly, I want to thank the library. The library makes it possible for me to do my work, and I'm very pleased to be in the library to do this today, and particularly the interlibrary loan people, and they're here at different places. When you can put your hands up if you want. That's my second home, really, the interlibrary loan bar. I don't know if they really like me or not, because I do put an awful lot of requests in to get some rather esoteric things. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues, to my friends, and to my students as well, who have provided much of the inspiration. Well, now, on this reading business, Steve said I could do anything I wanted as long as it was my own work. It was the only requirement, and I assume it could be unpublished. It would be unpublished if I wanted to quote, no problem with that. So I'm going to begin in a kind of unusual way, and I didn't check this out with anybody, not even my wife. But I did, before I was a writer, so to speak, I was a writer, but not of words, of music. And my parents, if they were both gone, would be very surprised, in fact, to see me here as a writer, since they had other plans for me, and that was to compose music. It was going to be my major and so on. None of that matters, except that in 1968, not too long after I joined the faculty, I teamed up with Cyril Birch, some of you may know, who was a professor emeritus of, I guess it's now called East Asian Languages, different title then. He was an expert in Chinese literature, and he and I wrote a song to commemorate the centennial. He wrote the lyrics, and I wrote the music. And so this California Centennial song was presented as all propriety and so on to the chancellor and so on. And I'm told that it was actually sung at a tree planting ceremony on campus. Unfortunately, Steve Tollefson was not running that event, so I never was told about it. And so I missed the only performance of this song. I've actually never heard the song sung, so I'm going to sing it. So you're stuck. It's very short. Remember, the lyrics are Cyril Birch, so he gets blame or responsibility for that. I wrote the music. To California our pride shall belong, triumphant may she ever stay. To hail our youth, let our voices be strong, and to honor the young of yesterday. The blue of sky with the gold of the sun recalls the glory of our past. 100 years and we've only begun, for the noblest of offspring is the last. The stadium roar that echoes from the hills, the chiming of the campanile bells, and every sound of Berkeley rhapsody that tells our story across the shining bay. Hey. To California our pride shall belong, triumphant may she ever stay. To hail our youth, let our voices be strong, and to honor the young of yesterday. California. I don't know how you feel, but I feel a lot better now that I've heard the song performed, even if I had to do it myself. All right, now I'm going to just have a couple of brief passages. The first is autobiographical, and it comes from the preface of Cracking Jokes. I love puns, and a lot of times I write the article only to have something, to match the pun. I wrote a paper years ago called Rejoice, No Inn at the Womb. This was a study of James Joyce's Ulysses. And even Cracking Jokes, you see, was a play on cracking jokes, telling, but also crack in the sense of deciphering. And then I did this thing on, Gallus as Phallus, it's the cockfight. Gallus as Phallus, a psychoanalytic cross-cultural study of the cockfight as foul play. Now I have some titles that I've not yet found the substance to write. One of my best titles, and I'm going to give it out in case some of you can probably more qualified than I write. I think it'd be great to have an article called Theodicy and the Odyssey. But I don't know that I'm qualified to write it. Anyway, in Cracking Jokes, here's from the preface. All my life I've loved jokes. I cannot remember a time when I did not enjoy hearing someone tell a joke well. From grade school on, I became avidly interested in jokes, frequently repeating favors to anyone who would listen to me. I recall with nostalgia how my father, despite his fatigue after a day of work 60 miles from home, would often share a new joke he had heard during the day. Nearly 40, 50 years later, I could still retell some of the jokes he told. During my high school years, I eagerly devoured the few compilations of published jokes available in local libraries. I learned dirty jokes at adolescent outings, parties, and summer camp. At that time, I simply enjoyed the jokes without a thought that I might ever want to study them seriously. In college, as an English major, I learned to appreciate humor in more literary terms. Comedy was something that any student of classical writers or of Shakespeare had to take into consideration. Eventually, I discovered Freud's essay, Wit and Humor in the Unconscious. I marveled at the lucidity of his writing, even in translation from the German, and at the truly remarkable insights contained in his brilliant analysis of the jokes he presented. After graduating from college, I served in the Navy for 2 years, where I heard hundreds upon hundreds of jokes. Often during a dull 4-hour watch, the men on duty with me would swap stories to help while away the time. I participated for pleasure. It never occurred to me to take notes on these jokes or to record them. Only in graduate school at Indiana University, in the doctoral program in folklore, did I finally discover that jokes were standard folklore genre and that it was perfectly all right to investigate them. In a course in American folklore taught by the late Professor Richard M. Dorson, we were required to make a collection of folklore, and we were permitted to use ourselves as informants. My own considerable repertoire of jokes I discovered was enough to fulfill this assignment. I was astonished to learn that the great Finnish folklorist Antti Arna had included the category jokes and anecdotes in his pioneering tale type index, the Verzeichnis der Märchentypen. I soon realized that some of the jokes I had heard in childhood were merely American versions of international tale types, with analogs in Europe, the Near East, and even Asia. Still later, I delved into Gershon Legman's massive scholarly treatment of dirty jokes. Legman's unique combination of erudition and analysis made a lasting impression on me. Of course, jokes are only one genre of folklore. I have spent many years studying other genres as well: myths, proverbs, riddles, legends, superstitions, and so on. I find all folklore challenging, and I never cease to be grateful that I became a professional folklorist. And now, skipping to another paragraph, as a folklorist, I've come to believe that no piece of folklore continues to be transmitted unless it means something, even if neither the speaker nor the audience can articulate what that meaning might be. In fact, it usually is essential that the joke's meaning not be crystal clear. If people knew what they were communicating when they told jokes, the jokes would cease to be effective as socially sanctioned outlets for expressing taboo ideas and subjects. Where there's anxiety, there will be jokes to express that anxiety. A society with political repression will generate an abundance of political jokes. Indeed, the more repressive the regime, the more numerous the political jokes. So that from the preface of Cracking Jokes, which is out of print, so I'm not plugging it. Now, by the way, they've refitted. There was wonderful praise for this room, which they've refitted. I think it's great that the Morrison room is refitted. However, the heat is on. Apparently, with the retrofitting, they can't turn the heat off. No comment about buildings and grounds. Brief passage from Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow, which I consider, for what it's worth, my best book. And I had a little trouble finding a publisher to take it, but that's another story. I won't go through it, but it has to do with pollution and the separation of mouth and rear end and so on. And I have a discussion of the Indians, it's from India now, not liking Americans and other European customs, such as blowing your nose and then putting the handkerchief in your pocket. They find this quite disgusting. They don't like our use of toothbrushes because saliva is defiling, even your own saliva. So once you've got saliva in something, you can't put it back in your mouth. You have to use something else to brush your teeth. In that connection, after that discussion, I say, besides the handkerchief and the toothbrush, there is one additional, well-regarded by Europeans, hygienic accoutrement, which is despised by Hindus, and that is the bathtub. We learn from our tales of Crow and Sparrow, which I won't repeat here, that mouth and anus should be kept apart, be kept separate. Yet, unless one is willing to dive headfirst into a tub full of water, this simply cannot be accomplished. One sits in a tub, which thereby allows water to flow around and over one's genitals and buttocks. Then, with the same water, one washes one's face. From a Hindu point of view, this is absolutely disgusting. And even to a Westerner, if he or she bothered to think at all about it, the idea of rinsing one's rear end and then using the same water to wash one's face is not particularly pleasant. This may be why some Westerners prefer showers to bathing in tubs. There's also the matter of sharing a tub, e.g. small children may be bathed in succession or together in the same water. When writer Salman Rushdie was about to leave Bombay at age 13 to go to school in England, his mother had reservations, partly because of what she understood to be English bathroom customs. Quote, they wipe their BTMs with paper only, instead of using water, as Indians do. Although, also, they get into each other's dirty bath water. And even Rushdie himself alludes to the same issue in his novel Midnight's Children. Quote, for 2 months we must live like those Britishers. You've looked at the bathroom, no water near the pot. I never believed, but it's true. My God, they wipe their bottoms with paper only. Good example of ethnocentrism, because they think we're disgusting and dirty. Anyway, that's from Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow. Now, just a couple more, and then we'll have to open it up here, interview. Probably my most controversial book is this Holy Writ is Oral Lit. The Bible is folklore. And just do a couple of passages from it. From the acknowledgments in the front, this is one little piece. This book combines a lifelong love of the Bible with a career in the study of folklore, and so on and so on. I want to read the acknowledgement, though. I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to my dear wife, Carolyn, who has encouraged me in this as in all my scholarly endeavors, and especially for repeatedly asking, isn't all this pretty much known by readers of the Bible? Is there anything new or original in what you're saying? I thought those were very good questions. Let me just say a little passage from the book. It has to do with written folklore, and I think Carolyn mentioned that I've done these books on Xerox folklore with my friend Carl Pachter, who took an extension course from me, and we became friends. He was a vice president for a major corporation, but a folk singer as a hobbyist, and we've done now 4 or 5 books together on the Xerox fax folklore. So there is written folklore, whether it's autograph book verse, bathroom wall writings, whatever, or flyleaf inscriptions. The recognition of written folklore is critical to our consideration of the Bible. It is precisely the failure of all previous biblical scholars to recognize this that tends to invalidate all earlier research. By equating folklore with oral tradition only, these scholars supposedly were able to distinguish between folklore, oral tradition, on the one hand, and the Bible, written tradition, on the other. Once the oral criterion is removed or shown to be inadequate, the supposed distinction between oral folklore and the written Bible is placed in serious doubt. But even the oral element was not properly understood. It is not enough to acknowledge that the Bible was an oral tradition before being written down, with the assumption that once written down, folklore ceases to be folklore. But strange to say, this is what is stated in the scholarship. Quote, a tradition ceases to be such at the point at which it is removed from its normal context in life and is entered into a written composition. This is a faulty premise. An oral proverb once written down does not then magically cease to be a proverb. Once a proverb, always a proverb. A legend once written down does not stop being a legend. The point is that if the Bible was once folklore, why is it not still folklore? Just because it was written down does not automatically negate its original folkloristic nature. And that's all I'll give you from that if you're interested. Look at the book. Last one is the book that's been out 3 weeks now, not even on the table over there. And it's called International Folkloristics. It's a book I've been working on for about 35 years. And although it's an edited book and has selections from Grimm, there are about 20 different selections, almost all dead white males, my role in it was to have introductions, and my headnotes are actually in some cases longer than the article itself. This tells you something. I'm just going to give you a little bit. I thought I'd do the headnote to Fraser, since people have known about Fraser. And just to give you a little sense of what my writing style in these headnotes. Because Fraser believed all peoples on the earth had passed through identical stages from savagery to civilization, he employed a form of the comparative method to ascertain the origins of folklore, which he regarded as survivals from the savagery period. To illuminate folklore, which was essentially limited to the traditions of peasants living in a state of barbarianism, or the vestiges thereof retained among civilized peoples, it was necessary to compare folklore items with what Fraser assumed were the fuller, more complete, and original forms still to be found among contemporary savages. With this premise and its assumption of universalism, Fraser felt perfectly justified in taking data out of particular cultural contexts to be cited in his vast compendiums of parallels to particular myths and customs. A fine example of his technique is his compilation of myths of the origin of fire, this is London 1930, which includes texts from all over the world drawn from extremely arcane and fugitive printed sources. One problem that inevitably arose from the consideration of the whole world as a potential source of parallels was that the task of accumulating additional data was endless. And this is perhaps why Fraser's research projects kept expanding to inordinately swollen proportions. Thus, an original encyclopedia article on totemism in 1885 turned into an 87-page book 2 years later, and by 1910 became the 4-volume, 2,000-page Totemism and Exogamy. Similarly, a Festschrift essay for E.B. Tyler, Folklore in the Old Testament, in Anthropological Essays presented to Tyler, 1907, developed into the 3-volume Folklore in the Old Testament in 1918. But the most incredible example of all is Fraser's magnum opus, The Golden Bough. In 1885, Fraser wrote a three-page essay, Taboo, for the Encyclopedia Britannica. By 1890, this essay had become the first edition of The Golden Bough, consisting of 2 volumes. 10 years later, the second edition, now 3 volumes, was published. Fraser continued to ransack ethnographies and missionary reports for further parallels. Finally, in 1913, the third edition appeared in 12 volumes. And even then, Fraser was not finished. In 1936, a single volume entitled Aftermath, a supplement to The Golden Bough, was published, bringing the total number of volumes to 13. And then I talk about the passage in Virgil's Aeneid that was supposed to be the the basis of it all. It turns out it's pretty much fake. He made it up himself. The only detail omitted from his own account of this imagined golden bough business was that the successor, or the person who comes into the sacred grove, was obliged to first pick the golden bough from the tree guarded by the incumbent before slaying him. Inasmuch as it took 13 bulky volumes to explicate this passage, one could perhaps call the golden bough the longest footnote in the history of scholarship. One last bit on Fraser, and I'll stop. Fraser's pillaging of ethnographic sources from all over the world is parallel to the situation of the colonialist British Empire, which exploited materials from subject peoples throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. His choice of a passage from Virgil to begin his voyage of exploration, the Golden Bough, might well reflect his basic orientation as a classicist. But the particular passage chosen may have symbolic significance. Breaking the Golden Bough allowed Aeneas to enter the underworld. Fraser used the passage as a metaphorical excuse to enter the underworld of what he deemed savagery. In other words, this gave him an excuse to talk about these very odd, bizarre customs in a scholarly role. Anyway, that's the kind of headnote that I wrote for the different scholars of these founders of folklore. And I will stop there with this brief sampling of my writings. And thank you again for allowing me to do this. We now move away from the heat. Yeah.
One bit of business first, and that is, if you haven't noticed, please notice that ASUC Bookstore has a table of Professor Dundes' books over there at discount, not because they are on the remainder table, discounted just for this event today, and I understand they are taking any form of payment. So buy some books. They're all wonderful. And that leads me actually to my first point. One of the great things for me about doing this series is that I get to read things and learn things that I wouldn't normally have read. And I've learned so much from reading your books. It's been a joy. And perhaps the biggest joy for me is learning a new word. And I have learned the word latrinalia, which means writing on bathroom walls. And I plan to use that word a lot because it makes me sound so much more intelligent. And I want to thank your wife, because now that I have read the books and know that she took out all the thuses, I saw it not one thus, and it was a pleasure.
Okay.
But I think we're in for sort of a culture clash, because your children would call nervously and say, "What is Dad writing about?" My father was a Lutheran minister, so when we asked what Dad was writing about, it was clearly not the same thing. And I assure you that as a Norwegian Lutheran, we do not have bathroom habits at all. So it doesn't matter. So first question.
Okay.
Oh, when I called you and invited you to do this, you graciously said yes, but you also said, "I don't really consider myself a writer, but a compiler." And I think that was just modesty, but can you talk about that?
Well, one of the kinds of books that I've done is what I call case books. And I got the idea from legal studies, really, although I don't like the way they do them. In legal studies, they bring together snippets, really, and they do abridgments and so on. I don't like that. I like to let an author speak for him or herself. So what I've done in a series of case books, although it took me a long time to find a publisher that would do this, was to bring together a group of essays on a particular subject. Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, the cockfight, the evil eye, the blood libel, and so on. Often, the particular topic of the casebook was suggested by being invited to give a paper. For example, in the vampire thing, I was invited to a conference at NYU to give a paper on the vampire. I went because I got to meet Stephen King, and although I went to his paper, he didn't come to mine. You know how that is. But, and he was in a T-shirt and dungarees like he can't afford, anyway, but it was fun to see him. In any case, having to work up a paper on the vampire, I went to the library, again, my second home, and read everything I could find. Whatever I work on, I like to see whether anybody else has said it before, if there's anything new to say about it. And in the process of doing this, I found different articles that I thought were pretty good. And so at the end, rather than just publishing my essay in a journal, I put it in a case book, along with whatever it was, a dozen or so other essays on the vampire. So I put together what I thought the best essays on the vampire were, and we published it as a case book, essentially. And the idea of that is, first of all, a lot of these essays are in some cases very obscure journals. They're not going to be at small liberal arts colleges. They don't have those kind of periodicals. And even we don't have all of them. I had to send to interlibrary loan to get some of these journals. So it's to upgrade the teaching of folklore. So in a sense, I compile that book. I'm an editor of the book. On the other hand, anybody that has read any of my things knows that it's not just scissors and paste, that I try to put each essay into some kind of historical or intellectual perspective. And as I say, in some cases, people have been charitable and kind, saying that there's more information in the headnote sometimes than in the essay. Because sometimes I put the essays in to make the point. This is not a very good approach to whatever topic it is, Cinderella or writing, and so on. It's kind of mean to do that when you write the author for permission. I'd like to reprint your essay. You don't tell them because it's a bad example of... But it's important as a teaching tool to show here is the range of interpretations of a particular point. So many of my books are in a sense, edited books, but they do take a lot of work. And just getting the permissions, because as I'm sure most or many of you know, authors are responsible to get permissions. You have to get permission from the authors, from the publishers, from the holders of copyright, and sometimes it can take 10 or 15 letters sometimes because we're no longer the publisher. We didn't. One publisher said we didn't publish the book, so I sent on the title page that had their name on it. Well, this was under a sublease or something from some other publisher and so on, and then you have to write each one and start over again. It's a terrible job to get permissions. So there's a lot of work goes into these case books, in fact, but I like to think that they are useful teaching tools in the case of folklore so that people, even at small schools, can use the Cinderella casebook or the Lord Riding Hood casebook or the Wisdom of Any, which is on the proverb, and so on, and, as I say, to upgrade the teaching of folklore. So I'm a compiler in that sense.
I'd like to now backtrack to some more basic questions that some eyebrows were raised when you were being introduced about some of these things. So what I want to know is, do you write on a computer? Do you write on a typewriter?
I have written on an electric typewriter for many, 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 many years, and I was dragged kicking and screaming into the computer world by a visiting Israeli folklorist's husband, who was an expert on computers, and he insisted that I get a computer because he was a whiz on it. Fortunately, my son who works at the Wells Fargo is also a whiz, so he can help me. And now I like it, sort of, because it's true, you can revise more easily, you can add stuff instead of having to use the arrows and paste it and all the rest of it. But it still drives me crazy, particularly as I'm not very good at it, and if you push one wrong button, everything disappears. And lines jump around, and you can't get them back somehow. And then I have to call my son and say, what do I do? And I feel very awkward at having to act like basically a child. Even when my grandson, age 4, this was the computer. This was putting a tape in the VCR. Forget the time and the clock on it. I just wait for the year to change again for the time. But at that time, I didn't know there was a little arrow on the top of the cartridge. It shows you, how many professors have changed light bulbs. I mean, and this little 4-year-old looked at me in amazement because we were putting the tape on for him. It was one of these kiddie things. So he said, "Just a minute," and he took it away from me and put it in immediately. And I felt just terrible. Now I learned to put a tape in the VCR. But, so I do use a computer, but reluctantly.
And how long have you been using this computer?
About a year and a half, maybe.
I just thought that would be something.
Yeah, I do use it, and I do like it. I love it for Melville, actually. It's wonderful. I used to have to go to the library to look up everything. Now I can look it up at home. That I like. That's terrific. It's worth it for Melville alone.
So when do you write? Actually, I think you must be writing now while we're talking because you've written so much. But do you have a time of day?
I used to get up early in the morning, sometimes late at night, maybe too tired. And one thing I want to say about, people say, well, where do you get your ideas and so on? You get them at odd times. When I was younger, I had to force myself sometimes because you get an idea when you're half asleep. And it's a great idea, either like one of these titles that I like, or just an idea for a paper or a book or whatever. And you think to yourself, I'm going to remember this in the morning. But I've learned you don't always, because all you remember in the morning is I had a great idea. What the heck was it? So I get up. I force myself to get up and write it down. Well, my writing's very bad, and sometimes in the morning I have written it down, but I still can't read it. But I do. You have to act. Also in the shower is a good time. You get a great idea in the middle of the shower. Of some idea, because you're thinking about whether the lecture you're going to give or the paper or review you're going to write, whatever it is, and you get this great idea, you must write it down on the spot. And I'll tell you one tip on writing, as long as this is supposed to be about writing.
And I got the tip from Archer Taylor, who was a professor here, professor of German, one of the great folklorists, perhaps one of the two greatest folklorists in this century, along with Tollefson, Indiana. He was professor of German here. And he told me this, as I studied with him briefly at an institute. He said, you know, when you have an idea for a paper or for a book or a research project, even if it's not the one you're working on, and this is, by the way, why I do my own Xerox. People laugh at me because I do my own Xerox. I don't ever send, I don't use Baker or any of these other things that people send graduate students and so on. No, I go to the library myself. I Xerox the article I want. The reason for that is the article I've gone to look for is terrible, stupid. The best thing about it was the title. But the article next to it, fabulous. Nobody's ever mentioned it. And maybe it's not even on the topic that I'm working on now, but it's a topic I want to work on, so I Xerox it. And you can't teach anybody to do that. It's like the book next to the book you're looking for is good. So you have to do your own research. Anyway, Archer Taylor's idea was this. When you get an idea for a paper that you want to write, start a folder. Now it would be, I guess, a file or whatever these computer terms are. In other words, you get a folder and you write this little idea on. Maybe that's all you've got in the beginning, or maybe one reference, one little esoteric reference that you ran across next to the article you were reading. And what happens is, over the years, these folders grow, because every time you get a reference, there's something that's relevant to this topic, you throw it in the folder. And then when somebody says, would you give a paper on this and so, or you must submit now to a Festschrift or whatever it is, you say, well, now what should I write on? You go and look at your folders and see which one of them have enough in them to warrant going ahead and doing the research. I think it's a terrific idea. It's a simple idea, really, because the way you do it normally is you're in the library, you're reading something, it's great, and the next article is great, and you say, gee, I must remember where that is. You know, the third book from the end and the green cover and so on. I'll remember where it is. You won't remember where it is. Write it down then and there, make the reference, put it in that folder, because there it is. It's there for you next time or whenever you get around to writing the thing. It's a very simple thing, but it helps a lot. So I write anytime I can. One nice thing about my own personality is, and this is just a piece of luck, I'm able to stop writing in the middle of whatever it is, go away, teach my class, do whatever I have to do, be on the committee, whatever, and come back even a day or two later, and I can pick it up. So that's very helpful, because unless I'm in the middle of a sentence, when I may not know, but in general I can do that. I also like to work on more than one project at a time. And one of the problems I've had in my own field, people have been critical of me. Even Stiff Thompson, the other great folklorist, along with Archer Taylor, once said to me after I did all these different things, he said, why don't you just do one thing and stay with it? And he did the 6-volume motif index. You know, I mean, he had certain projects that he thinks, and some scholars do this. They spend 15 or 20 years working on it. I can't do that. After a year or two, if I haven't finished it, forget it. So I like to work on different things. So I don't have any area of expertise. All my colleagues in Anthro, they're experts in this field or that field, or that, in Africa or Southeast Asia or this topic. I don't have any area. So you're in an anthropology department, you don't have any area? How can that be? I don't have any area. I work on different things, from the caste in India to Xerox folklore in our own culture to German national character. It's whatever sort of strikes my fancy, or a good question that a student asks me that I can't answer. See me at the end of the hour, I don't know, because I don't know the answer. And then I'll go check it out. So I write it all different times of the day and night.
Not
to answer your question.
Not to denigrate the last 2/3 of your answer, but I do need to know about the shower. So
how much do you want to know?
Not as much as you think.
I sing.
If you get up in the night to write something down, and you said that you always have to write down, so do you have an erasable, waterproof?
No. The shower is. I wait till I get out of the shower to write it down. That was your question. But it is amazing how you get ideas when they come, when they strike you. And I don't know why. Maybe other people have the same experience. That sometimes in the shower you're mulling things over, of what you're going to read that day or something, and you get an idea about something, or something a puzzle that you've had, and you haven't been able to solve. All of a sudden you get a solution or a possible solution. And you think to yourself, I've got to check this out. This might be the answer. Something that I've been wrestling with and I haven't been able to figure out.
So how does that translate for part of our audience who are students, undergraduates, who are being given assignments, or at least given general areas, and are always struggling with this issue, right? What should I write about? I don't know what to write about. Or on this topic, I don't know what to write about. Is there anything in the way that they come to you that you can? Well,
I've never been one for giving students assignments. There's certain old-fashioned professors, not so much here, I don't think at Berkeley, I shouldn't speak for everybody else, but in the old days, the professor would say, you will do the following.
I mean, when Sid Thompson in essay, you will do a motif index of early Irish literature, you will do the Old Testament. I mean, people were assigned what they had to do. And I think in some science labs it's pretty much that way. Whatever the grant is, you have to go work on what the professor does, and then everybody's name goes on, 12 names. I like people to pick their own topics. So even though students say, please tell me what to write, I won't do it. I mean, I think you have to find your own topic. I don't care what the topic is. All I insist on is you do it well. And I can give them help as to where to find information about the topic once they've picked it. But there are simple ways of doing this. If you're in a given field and you're looking for a topic, let's say you're looking for a topic in folklore, you go to the library. That's where all these things are held and found. So you go to the International Folklore Bibliography, Internationale Volkskundliche Bibliography, 1917 on, and you go through the pages and you'll see what folklorists since 1917 have written about. And if you can't read through these volumes and find something that interests you, probably shouldn't be taking the course.
Note that. How much do you draft and revise, or do things always come out like this, just perfect?
No.
It came out just that way?
No. I'm not a natural-born writer. I have students who are, who some of them I'm just stunned at the way they can write, and it's just beautiful prose. I don't have that kind of gift, and that's why I may have told you in the very beginning I was very surprised to be invited to this. I think I write clearly. I'm certainly not modest, God knows. But I'm not a great stylist. I'm just not. But I try to hone it or polish it enough so that it's clear. And then I have my built-in home critic to, in some cases, to make sure that it is really clear. But you have to revise to some extent. But I think part of it is experience. Well, one problem, experience is good. You learn how to write and you get in the groove. The problem, though, is also that you do get in a groove. And as not only my wife, but others have told me, I always preach at the end of the article that people should be doing this, or whatever it is. And I've had to force myself to try not to get into some of these grooves. I also have trouble starting an essay. I'm okay once I'm into it, but to get into it sometimes is very hard to, and that's where often I get some help from my wife and others to get into it a little more gracefully and elegantly than I normally do. But at this point, once I have the data, I can usually, one of the most difficult things, although I've been fortunate there, is the organization question, which you haven't asked me. As you have your data, how do you, it's coming, next page. But how do you arrange the data to make your best argument? I do use the straw, I guess you have to say straw person these days. That is to say, I do think you should always indicate what has been done before. And so that helps a little bit, as it's sort of an obvious thing. Okay, who has written on the vampire before? What have they said? And I think you need to do that, first place, to get it published, because otherwise somebody's going to say, does this person know the literature or whatever. So you sort of do some review. You say what the problem is, then you say what's been done about it, and then you try and do something new about it. This is very oversimplified, but it does have three, which is good.
You said that introductions, that the opening of an essay is hard.
Sometimes very hard to get into it.
Did you mean
the first couple of paragraphs are hard.
But did you mean when you're first writing, or did you mean when you're revising to make it right?
It's always hard somehow. It's always hard because, of course, the introduction has to match the conclusion, you see. And by the time you get to the conclusion, it turns out it has nothing to do with your introduction, so you have to go back and pretend that that's what you were, going to prove all along.
I hate to stop and make points for perhaps some of my students who are here, but I hope you all noted that. Thank you very much. I owe you something for that. When do you know you're done?
Well, that's hard to say. I feel that once I've presented my data and made my analysis, I don't like data without analysis. I really like some kind of interpretation, even if it's subjective, even if it's controversial. I want to say that. And of course, there's always that fear that there's yet another piece of data there that would, make the case stronger, or whatever. But I don't have that problem. And I'm not one of these people that revises and proofs. Publishers hate this when they send you the galleys or even the page proofs, and the people who rewrite the entire thing. Of course, it costs you sometimes. And I don't have that problem. I usually, once I've sent it off, I'm usually satisfied that it's as good a job as I can do. And so that I don't have that problem. I somehow know that it's finished.
And in that process, before it's finished, besides your wife, does anyone else read
No.
your work?
No, I have wonderful colleagues here, and I often read their things if they ask me to, but I've never asked colleagues to read. In some ways, I think it's an imposition, and I just don't. Also, at this point, I trust my own judgment maybe enough. Although, and I know that I'm going to get comments from the reviewers if it's, well, either an article or a book. People are going to review it and they're going to make comments, and that I prefer. They're going to be peers of some kind. And I should say, and this is something just to mention, because some of you, when you see, you know, a whole bunch of books, you think, oh, well, this person just publishes this stuff and it's easy. I would say 90% of my books were not published by the first publisher I sent them to. One book that I did with Pachter, we finished in 1975, was published in 1987. That's a long time. I mean, that's why you need to have tenure before you do those kind of things. But a lot of my things, even the India, what I consider my best book, went to, I think, 6 university presses before we finally found a publisher. So even though you're experienced and you're a veteran, you've been around a while, and you have a reasonable publication record, the idea that you just send off the manuscript even that you think is fine, and that somebody's going to publish it, doesn't happen. I only mention that because people get discouraged. I've had a number of students over the years who've written wonderful papers. I've urged them to send them off, and it gets rejected by the journal, and they get so discouraged they put it in the bottom drawer and then don't ever publish it. That's a big mistake. My philosophy is, and I'm glad I have a chance to say it, my rule has always been, whether it's a book or an article, if it comes back, and as I say, most of them do come back, because people don't like Freud or they don't like me or who knows, my rule is I send it off the same day. The same day, and I already know, I have number 2, I send it to the best journal or the best publisher that I think is, and then when it comes back, I don't wait around because you get depressed when it comes back and somebody says, you know, you don't know what you're talking about or you're wrong or whatever. I don't, you know, I get tired. My wife tells me I don't need to hear it from these other people. So I just say, all right, it's going off to journal number 2, and of course I don't tell journal number 2 that it's come back from journal number 1. I just hope it isn't the same reviewers who say, oh, we've already said this is a lousy piece of work. You know, why are you sending it to me again? But that's my rule. Send it off the same day. And of course, sometimes you do get discouraged. You know, when it takes 4, 5, 6 years, you begin to doubt a little bit. Maybe it isn't as good as you thought. But so far, I've gotten things into print.
My next question, probably given what we've heard so far, seems sort of idiotic, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you ever get writer's block?
No.
Have you ever in your life had one moment of writer's block?
No. I will say one thing, the point I want to make, and you gave me an opportunity to say it. It's not writer's block because, and I was thinking the relationship between people who can't speak, you know, the people who have trouble getting up in front of a group and so on and speaking, that's not writer's block, it's whatever, speaker's block, whatever. I really like oral style, and not just because I'm a folklorist. I really like oral style, and you can just listen to the way I said that. I like oral style. And I have a terrible time with publishers. Well, I have a terrible time with the written language, because the written language doesn't do justice to oral style. And I like to use another thing, remember on the thus, all the exclamation points, they come out. Writing with italics, and one nice thing about the computer, you asked me about the computer, one nice thing about the computer is you've got italics, you've got boldface, you've got different fonts, which I finally figured out. And I like this because it comes closer to oral style where you can put not have the wrong emphasis and the wrong syllable. You know, as you can really say what you want with emphasis. The publishers don't like this. They like everything to be, you know, uniform. You have these little copy editors, these people who've just graduated, English majors, I probably, you know, they change the to the, change that to which or whatever, which to whatever it is. I mean, they love to do this and take out all the exclamation points, all the underlining, all the italics. Now, in the Bible book that this Holy Writ is Oral Lit, again, with the help of the computer on this, I thought, I'll put the biblical texts all in italics to show that this is not my writing, to separate my writing, the normal Roman whatever style, from the Bible. And when I wanted to show that there were multiple versions of stories in the Bible, I would underline certain words or sentences in the biblical text to show that they were obviously cognate texts of the same stories. So I wanted to use my regular type for me, the italics for the biblical passages, and then boldface for these passages. Well, they went crazy with this at the publishers. They said, you can't do that. You can't. It's not done. It's, you know, whatever. And they carefully took all that stuff out and sent me the proofs. And so I had to undo the entire, you know, no, but I do want italics and I do want boldface and so on and so on. And they did go along with me, and it's so much easier to read. But publishers are really locked into whatever is the Chicago Style Manual or whatever the hell it is, and it's very hard
It's very hard to insist on your own style. And in my case, I like oral style. I like coming as close to oral style as possible. I like to think that when people read my work, as I say, it's not great style, but that you could hear me talking, so to speak. I try to make it conversational. I'm talking to you, and this is what I think about this, and this is my data. Not that I'm using first person necessarily, but that it is a conversational kind of oral style, which I like.
Okay, you've made me skip to page 5, where we're going to talk about style.
Okay.
Vampire book. Vampire book. Question from my students. In the book on vampires, Professor Dundes has the last word, of course, as the person who does the book. He gets to have the last essay.
Yeah.
And there's an introduction to his own essay talking very interestingly about the difference between myth and legend and folklore. And then the last short paragraph is this. The final essay in this volume is an attempt by a folklorist with a confessed Freudian bias to interpret the vampire as a creature of legend. Whether or not it constitutes any advance in our understanding of this remarkable nightmarish figment of the human imagination is for the reader to judge. And my students wanted to know why you talked about yourself in the third person rather than saying I.
Well, I was taught 100 years ago that you leave I out, basically, of formal writing. And I still sort of believe that. Although now, as many of you surely know, this is one of the new trends, certainly in anthropology. See, in anthropology, it was always third person. You report on the group that you're studying and so on, and the ethnographer was always left out. Now, we're always interested in who the ethnographer is and how they feel and their relationship to the informant. In fact, in some of these modern, postmodern ethnographies, you learn an awful lot about the ethnographer and almost nothing about the people. I didn't feel good that I had a bad breakfast, didn't get a good night's sleep. I mean, it's very interesting, but I'm not sure, as I say, that it's real ethnography, but I know I'm behind the times on this sort of intersubjectivity and all the rest of it. So I really prefer to, in a sense, treat my own essay as I treat all the other essays by, and also a little feigned modesty there, I thought. I know that I'm saying something new and interesting and important, but you can't say that. A reviewer has to say that. You can't just end the article saying, okay, all these other people have presented, that's okay, but now I'm going to say what this. So it's sort of like, I'm pretending that the reader can make this judgment about whether my essay is any good. It's like in rhetoric, all these tropes and devices. A Cicero, surely I don't need to remind you that, I mean, it's just a trope. Don't take it too seriously.
I'm deeply and personally hurt. But that's okay. I can get right back at you. I'm sure he said, but someone honestly correct me if I'm wrong. I thought that he said that he tried to steer away from the use of I. Did you hear him?
Except
say
in
that?
the preface that I read. Which is I.
If any of you have the program with you, the brief Dundes reader.
Now I'm in trouble, I can see that.
I'm just warming up on the I, by the way.
Well, the eyes have it.
The second one, there are a number of issues in this second passage, but we'll just do the I for a moment and then come back to the other. Of all the various aspects of caste, untouchability is surely the most perplexing and, if I may be permitted a value judgment, the most horrifying. There's that.
No, but I want to say a comment about that because that's a very important issue now in modern day anthropology and I guess other fields too. And that is, are you allowed to express a value judgment on the subject matter that you're investigating? Now, in the old days, you didn't do that. It was supposed to be theoretically objective, value-free, and so on. And also there was this accusation of so-called Orientalism of Said and so on that, we're coming into another culture and then we're making judgments about it. And so should I be allowed to say that I think untouchability is a bad thing? I think if you read the literature on it, it's pretty hard. And the Indians themselves say, and I quote Gandhi and Naipaul and these others, they think it's pretty terrible too. I don't think it's wrong for me to say it, but I did wonder about it, and I did pause a little bit. I wouldn't say it was a block, but I did pause, saying, I wonder if I should come out and say that I think untouchability is bad. And I've written an essay in this last book on anti-Semitism, for example. I mean, I do think it's hard not to have some kinds of value judgments here. So I do indulge in a sense, and I think it's okay to do it on occasion. On the other hand, I think you can overdo it. I think, does anybody really care necessarily what the author thinks? do we want to know what the situation, what the date is, and we'll draw our own conclusions.
I, of course, was only picking on the little word I, but I want to skip for a moment to the value judgments. I have other examples of I that don't have value judgment.
Okay.
But that is something that struck me, especially in Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow, that you felt free to say that this is a terrible, horrible thing. And so I wanted to know a little more about, is that something that people, you said that was the book that was hardest to get
I had a terrible time getting published because there's a terrible business in the academy, and I don't know what to do about it. I can't do anything about it, really. And that is the whole turf business. You know, I'm not an Indologist. I mean, Max Muller, the great Indologist of the 19th century, the greatest scholar of India, never once went to India. Now, those are the days. You just stay in the library and don't, you know. You can't do that now. And so what happened was I'm not an Indologist. I did go to India, actually, and I loved it and so on. But I'm not an Indologist. I've done a lot of field work there. I use the field work of others, much as Fraser and even Levi-Strauss and others do. They use other people's work. But I'm sure that my book, you see, was sent to be reviewed by professional Indologists who said, who is this guy? You know, what does he do? He doesn't know anything about India. How can he write a book about my subject? So it's a very tough thing to do, and whether you're right or wrong, there's still a feeling somehow of turf. And I feel the same way when I see people writing about folklore who don't know anything about it. I mean, I feel, you know, how these people are experts. Everybody's an expert on folklore because they know what it is, they think.
And have you gotten criticism for the value judgments, because they are noticeable in that book, and this is the larger issue of at what point does a scientist or a social scientist remove him or herself from the topic?
Well, it hasn't been reviewed, so I haven't had much. It was not only hard to get published, it's also hard to get reviewed. And the one review that was actually mentioned in the introduction was a very negative review. TLS just ripped me to shreds. Although I was pleased to be in TLS in a way, it doesn't matter. But it was a very negative review, terribly negative review. The only good thing about it was, I might tell the story because it's kind of fun. At the back of Crow and Sparrow, in the very back, the publisher put praise for, and then did the title of the book. And they quoted some people who had reviewed the book and so on, or were sent for comment. So it's the title of the back of the book says, Praise for Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow. But that's not the title of the book. The title of the book is Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow. Well, the idiot reviewer for TLS called the book Praise for Two Tales of Crow and Sparrow. And there was no praise in the review at all, because this man hates Freud. He's a medievalist in England. I don't know why he was sent the book. He knows nothing about India, but he hates Freud. So I wrote a rebuttal. I didn't publish the rebuttal, of course. I said, it's interesting as a Freud, because he said nothing, Freud, I imagine somebody's still writing Freudian stuff, you know. And my point was, this is obviously a Freudian slip. He didn't want to give praise to the book, so he calls it Praise for. And the TLS editor said, it wasn't the reviewer, it was our fault. Except that in the body of the thing, it also called the thing Praise for. So it's clear the reviewer did do this, but they weren't about to. They were protecting the reviewer. But people have not criticized. I don't see how anybody would. I think anybody that wanted to defend untouchability, I mean, there got to be something wrong with them. It would be like defending racism or sexism. I mean, if there are people who want, I mean, there are people who believe in that stuff, but they haven't taken me to task, and I've done it rather sparingly, only in these, I think, issues where it's clearly something that most of us, I think, would agree, and that the people themselves agree. There's people in India, the government tried to ban untouchability. It just didn't work. You can't enforce these kinds of things.
Throughout all your books, though, I really sense a moral stance, and not always just unbiased research. In the Up to Your Ass in Alligators, there are several references, and I think there may be even on this sheet, to the reason for studying this, for studying these kinds of folklore. Perhaps you can talk about that.
Well, this brings me to another issue which we've not yet discussed, and that's the issue of censorship. And I have had a terrible time with it. I'm sure many of my colleagues, I know they have. I know Laura Nader and I have discussed this a number of times. But I've had a terrible time in censorship for this reason, that oral tradition, as opposed to written now, the jokes you can tell at the water cooler, so to speak, may not be politically correct. They may be sexist, racist, whatever, offensive in some way. And so when you try to make the translation or transition from oral to written, you get into trouble, because you can't write these things. Now, in the last Xerox book, Beyond Alligators, that's the one that took 12 years to get into print,
sometimes the dragon wins. We sent that manuscript to the same press, Wayne State University Press, that had published the first 3, although it was a different editor. Figuring they did the first 3, the world didn't come to an end, maybe they'll do it. The editor, who had come over from University of Pennsylvania Press, took one look at the manuscript and said, of these 150 texts, he said, if you'll take 32 of them out, we might consider it. 32 out of 150? That's, I would have, 1 or 2 I might have considered, but 32 out of 150, that's too many. So I said, send it back, and I sent it to the old editor of Wayne State who had moved to Syracuse, and that's why, and they published it as is. So there's a real censorship problem with the stuff that's on email and fax, and I mean, whether it's Diana jokes or blonde jokes or Challenger jokes, or I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that is offensive. It is offensive. So what do? You have 2 choices. One, most folklorists just ignore it. Why bother? Just leave it alone. But I feel that these things need to be aired and discussed. I think if this is what people are talking about, if this is what the folklore is, let's have it. I got into terrible trouble when I published Auschwitz jokes, which I discovered the Germans were telling. And even I, as a folklorist, after all my years, was sort of shocked. They tell jokes about Auschwitz? How could this be? Well, only when they're drunk and they're so on. And I had to enlist the aid of a German because I said, no way I can collect them. And at first, I got a colleague over there to do it. He said, I'll help you. He said, but I don't want my name on this. But then he changed his mind later. He said, you know, you're right. I remember my grandfather telling me, because the modern-day Germans, you know, they weren't even born. They don't even want to think about these things. But when I published these Auschwitz jokes, and they're in Cracking Jokes, I did 2 articles. I did another follow-up on it. I got hate mail from people here in the States accusing me, a Jew, of being anti-Semitic. They said, how can you publish Auschwitz jokes? Aren't you playing into the hands? My feeling was, look, if the Germans are telling Auschwitz jokes now, we need to know about it. I mean, if they're still there's still anti-Semitism in Germany, and they're now in the Soviet Union with the lifting of those kinds of, I mean, I'm against censorship. I'm against covering these things up, and of course, whether it's in our culture, it's sexuality that's taboo, not politics. I had an article rejected from a Festschrift. This is impossible. A Festschrift is a surefire publication. I mean, when you're told you can send a thing, you figure, get the worst one of the folders out of the bottom drawer that you've never been able to place, send it off. So I sent off a thing on political East European political jokes to one of my old professors, and it was rejected. And it was rejected on the grounds, and the wall hadn't come down, the Soviet Union hadn't crumbled. The argument was, we want this book to be able to reach scholars in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And if your article is in there, the book will not be able to be used. It can't be sent there. So please send us another article. I said no. So we have censorship in our own culture. East European Quarterly rejected the same kind of article earlier on political jokes. And the editor said, yes, I know these jokes are traditional. I've heard them myself. But you've got to realize we have subscribers in Romania and so on, Czechoslovakia, and they will cancel the subscription if we publish your article. So sorry, you're rejected. So I've been fighting this all my life in terms of censorship, and as I say, I just sent it off to the next place. Actually, the Ukrainian Quarterly in New York published this article rejected by East European Quarterly because they were an emigre group and they hated socialism and communism. They were delighted to publish these but I had to publish it with that kind of a journal here. I couldn't publish it in a scholarly journal that went to these countries. So there's a lot of censorship in the academy. A lot of censorship, whether it's sexuality or political, and I'm against it. I try and fight it because I deal with what exists. I deal with the reality, the empirical, objective, phenomenological reality of folklore, what people do, what they tell, the Xerox, and if it's anti-establishment or anti-religion, I mean, I wouldn't be like Jesse Ventura and get up in a public place like this and say what I really think. I would, actually, but I'm not running for governor either.
And I'm not going to ask you those kinds of questions.
You're not going to ask me those kind of questions, sure.
I would recommend the 3rd paragraph on the sheet, which is from Up to Your Ass in Alligators, that explains why you think it's important, as you've been talking about, that we understand these things. As you said, that if Auschwitz jokes are being told, we need to know that. And I think this explains why very nicely. I want to leave time for questions, but I'm not done with mine.
All right.
I'll never finish. I had 10 pages of questions. Small thing about how you write and style. In interpreting folklore, there's a great line in reference to a category of jokes which I had put out of my mind, dead baby jokes from the 70s. Don't worry, I'm not going there. I just wanted, his line is, "It is never easy to make sense of nonsense, but that does not mean that nonsense is meaningless." Which is a wonderful line, and I guess my question is, did it come to you? Did you work on it? People want to know when they read things like that, where those kinds of ideas
Must have been the
come.
shower. No, actually, now I remember, the reporters left, but in the, I forget which Who's Who it is, you finally get into these books. Once you're in one, by the way, they keep, you know. Actually, I was removed once. I made Who's Who in the West, and then I disappeared. They took me out. I actually wrote them a letter, said, was it something I said? Anyway, I eventually got reinstated. But anyway, in one of these Who's Who things, I forget which one it is now, they said, do you have a motto or a credo or something? So they asked me the question, what is my credo? So I made up one. And I used part of that. I want to try and make sense out of nonsense, to find a rationale for the irrational, and to make the unconscious conscious, which got me essentially my Freudian bias in terms of my general attitude towards the material. So I like the sense of nonsense, because again, it's one of these punning things, which I love. I love puns. I always love puns. I used to drive my own parents and my family, my childhood friends crazy with puns. It's just a lot of fun.
Luckily, we got one on that sheet for you about the vampire book, so there's something.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know where that particular thing came from, but it had the three-part thing, which I've also written on, so I follow my own rules.
So let's end then with my last 40 question. No, let's end with, is there something that you wish you had never written, that you've written?
There are a couple things my wife wishes I had never written that are not just great articles, perhaps. But no, I don't think so. I mean, it's true when you read your own stuff, even sometimes in the delay, when you send it off and it finally comes back and proves you, did I write this? You know, how could I have said this? This is obviously wrong. But I don't have that feeling in general. I know a lot more now, obviously, than I did. I'm glad I did International Folkloristics, this latest book, now. Because when you're in graduate school, you don't know anything, it turns out. No, I didn't know that. You don't know that you don't know. I mean, you think, hey, I know I got a degree, I've got a PhD, I must know something. But it turns out you don't really. You learn how to learn, that's about it. And I remember, you haven't mentioned my book that I guess Phyllis just got, this Mother Wit from the Laughing Barrel. I was embarrassed. Here I was at Berkeley in the 60s, and I had African-American students coming and say, okay, you're supposed to be a folklorist. What should we read in African-American folklore? I thought, well, that's right, I have a PhD in folklore, I'm a professor of folklore. What do they read in African-American folklore? I didn't know. So I took a year or so off, and I read everything I could find in African-American folklore, and I put together what I thought were the best essays I could find, and I called it Mother Wit from the Laughing Barrel, which was a combination of two different metaphors. And so, again, it was a student question, basically, that got me involved in doing this. And so, yes, it turns out I called it Readings in Afro-American Folklore. Well, that's not politically correct anymore. I mean, I also wrote on North American Indian folk tales. And that's not politically correct. I mean, that's a problem, and I wish I had known to say African-American or whatever. In other words, but you can't foresee. So I'm sorry in that sense when I see the things that I've said that are no longer acceptable, but you can't hold me, you can't find fault with it. I mean, nobody could know that they're going to keep changing again to which term is in and which term is out. So why don't we throw it open to the general?
I think we need to. I had so much more to ask. Please, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, we'll take a few minutes, and I know people need to be also leaving,
class.
And you shouldn't feel that you need to just sit. But questions, please.
Introduce my wife? My wife is sitting over there. She likes to be anonymous, however, so she can critique later. And also people who don't know who she is will mutter things to her like, that's an idiot. And then she can tell me later all these things. So she does not normally like to be introduced, but she's sitting right over there very patiently.
We did need to give her that personal thanks for the thus thing.
Yes, and for the thus thing. A lot of thuses were removed.
Other questions?
That was an easy question to answer, though. All right. Well, yeah. The problem there is I only know about 5 million.
I'm going to tell one that I've heard recently, and I can only tell it for a few more months, so that's a good chance to tell it. And again, in one way, I think it's a good example of how folklore articulates what's on the collective mind of a people, in this case us. So God is going to destroy the world in 3 days. And he calls the 3 most important men on the face of the earth to inform them of this. So some of you know this, right? It's Boris Yeltsin, Bill Clinton, and Bill Gates. And he summons them all, and he tells them, I'm going to destroy the world in 3 days. Go forth. Tell them. So Yeltsin calls a meeting of, what is it, the Duma, whatever, the legislature, and after all assembly, says, I have 2 pieces of very bad news. First piece of very bad news, there is a God. Second piece of very bad news, he's going to destroy the world in 3 days. Clinton calls a joint meeting of Congress, House and Senate, and says, I have good news and bad news. The good news is there's a God. The bad news is he's going to destroy the world in 3 days. Bill Gates calls a meeting of the entire Microsoft Corporation, hundreds and hundreds of people. And he says, I have 2 pieces of very good news. First piece of very good news, I'm one of the most important men on the face of the earth. Second piece of very good news, the Y2K problem is moot. So that's only good for a few more months. But that's certainly, how many have heard that joke? Now, see, I'm not making this stuff up. Now that I could probably publish, but probably not maybe in a computer journal. Any other questions?
What interesting things could you say about that joke that we might miss at first glance?
Well, there's lots to say about it. First place, there's a whole good news, bad news pattern, and there are many jokes which have the good news, bad news pattern. You have the number 3, which I've written about it at some length, and this is loaded with 3s. It's a tripod, and there are reasons for that, and one of which is Freudian, as a masculine number. I think it has to do with the play on God and the existence of God. It's actually a rather serious philosophical question, after all. And of course, the play on the role of technology and business, or whatever you want to call it, in our society, that either you can have Gates, the equivalent of a president of a geopolitical state, or even that God he's in direct contact with God. Again, it's the elevation of somebody who doesn't have a real college degree and so on, but he could buy us all out 1,000 times over. There are hundreds of, actually, the thing is packed with really information about the Russian political system and something about Clinton and so on. I've also done a piece actually on Clinton jokes, which I published. So anything, not just jokes, but proverbs and folk songs, all this material is really tightly condensed material expressing the anxieties or the concerns of whatever people. And this also bothers me a little bit in trying to fight the good fight for my field of folklore, in that I was introduced by lots of English department people, and I used to be in an English department before I came to Berkeley. I was actually a faculty member in an English department. But in general, there are an awful lot of elitists who look down on this kind of material because they have their own little, rather, from my point of view, rather narrow set of issues and authors that they read who have made it into the sort of canonical state. And they tend to look down a little bit on the materials which are, shall we say, vulgar, vulgar not in the sense of obscene, but vulgar in the sense of belonging to the common people. And my feeling is it should be the other way around. I'm not opposed to studying esoteric, arcane material, as many elitists do, and I'm a product of it too. But I feel that, in a way, we should study what the majority of the people know. In other words, even elite people know their folklore. And so these jokes, in this case, are something which are known to pretty much to the whole society. Certain Clinton jokes were. And I feel that these things are worth, and and some of the ones, even on some of the Clinton ones, I was worried about getting them into print because they're really, really obscene. And some of the OJ jokes, even on the air, they say, well, I know the OJ jokes, but I'm not going to tell them, they would say. So, because we still have, in fact, in today's paper, my wife was pointing out that, CBS is now going to use one of the 4-letter words. We are still a very puritanical society. And that's why we have the problem with the censorship issue, because we still, I mean, you asked for a joke. I told one that was, shall we say, clean. I mean, there are a lot of jokes that are extremely sexist, and I have a very good sexist one in the Holy Writ book, and I put it in intentionally. People said, why did you do that? Aren't you going to offend people? I don't care. I'll tell that one, just as long as I was asked, was I? And I'll tell it because it illustrates the nature of things which are on the edge, and why you have to collect more than one version. So the first version, which is the sexist one, I'm warning you it's sexist, because there are many women present. A man goes to Denmark, it's dated a little bit, to have a sex change operation. And after the operation is performed, this person comes back to her friends, old friends, and they go out for a drink at a bar in New York or wherever. And they're three friends. And the first friend says, well, now, did it hurt when they, think Bobbitt here, when they removed the male anatomy? Oh, no, it was a total anesthetic. I felt no pain. It was, no pain. Felt nothing. Second friend says, well, did it hurt when they carved a female anatomical part? No, I told you, I had total anesthesia. I felt no pain whatsoever. So the third one asks, well, was there any part of this operation that caused you any pain or discomfort? Yeah, when they put a straw in my ear and sucked out half my brain. See, hear the gas? Yeah. Now, that's not politically correct, all right? Now, let me give you another version to show you why you have to always have other versions on hand. Same joke all the way through until the last friend again says, did anything about this procedure or process cause you any pain or discomfort? Yes. When I went back to work and they only gave me half my pay. Is that better? So this is why, as opposed to elitists who work with fixed texts, you know, every time they read the novel or interpret the novel, it's that same short story, that same novel, whatever. With folklore, it's always going to be, that's not the way I heard it, or I know it in a different way. And the different way is precisely what we're interested in, and how the different way reflects who's telling it, to whom, in the presence of whom else, and this is what we're interested in. These things are wonderful barometers or pulses, or what do you want to call it? I call it autobiographical ethnography. It's a picture of a people painted by the people themselves. So there may be bias, there may be distortion, but at least it's introduced by the people and not for the so-called objective observer who's coming in with usually an a priori questionnaire about what I expect to find, because I had to say this in my grant proposal. Any other? Yes?
If that's the case, then you hear saying different joke or whatever from several different people, how do you know where it's starting from? Do you figure out which one was the
All right. The question was, when you hear the same joke from different people, how do you know where it started from? The answer is you don't. And this is a very common question in folklore. People always ask you, what's the origin? And we don't know origins. All we have is the first recorded text of something, and that gives us a terminus ante quem. It must have been known before that, unless somebody... Let me give you an example of this, just to illustrate this. One of the jokes about Clinton that's going around, maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't, is, and again, you see why there's a censorship problem, and there's certain places I couldn't tell this or couldn't publish it. Actually, I'll tell the Nixon version first, because I heard it with Nixon. It's now told about Clinton, and I'll explain in a minute. So Nixon goes out of the White House one day in winter in Washington, and in the snow, written out in urine, is the F word, or I don't even want to say it in this august group in this room. F you, Tricky Dick. And he is really upset and really outraged at this. So he calls in the head of the FBI and the CIA, says, no, you've messed up before. I want to know who did this. I want you back here in 3 days when you tell me. So 3 days later, the head of the CIA and the FBI come in to report to Nixon. Well, what'd you find out? Well, this comes back to your question. It's good news and bad news. Well, what's the good news? The good news is we took the snow to the lab, we did an analysis of it, and it's Henry Kissinger's urine. Well, what's the bad news? The bad news is it's in Pat's handwriting. Now, this is now told about Clinton. This is not told about Clinton, only it's Al Gore's urine with either Hillary's handwriting or, in some cases,
Chelsea's handwriting. Ooh. Now see, look at that. You see? Now this, now you see, if you only heard the one text, in terms of your example, your hypothetical, you might assume, well, this is an interesting story. It must have been made up either about Nixon or about Clinton. Well, it turns out Vance Randolph, who was probably America's greatest collector of folklore, living in the Ozarks, and he collected a version which dates from 1890. In fact, you may have seen the book. It's one of the Randolph stuff was 8 volumes of unpublished Ozark folklore. It couldn't get it into print. Finally, and he died actually before most of it was in print, but one volume came out, I don't know if he's still alive then or not, but it's called Pissing in the Snow and Other Ozark Folktales. Have you seen that? University of Illinois Press. The title of that book is that story, and he collected a version from the 1890s with no reference to a president in it. So that's not the origin of it, that's just the version that he collected in the Ozarks. It may very well go back to Europe or to England and so on. So it's very hard to track some of these things down because people didn't record these things. They were considered to be too ephemeral or too risque, and people didn't bother. Now, of course, Chaucer, some of these stories are in fact recorded in Boccaccio and Chaucer. Many of our literary texts, in fact, are reworked tales and stories. But the origin question is pretty much a lost issue. We just don't know. And so all we can do is, rather than doing origins, which is what the 19th century was concerned with, we are now interested really in structure and function. Not diachronic analysis, but synchronic analysis. And so if we can figure out why people are telling this joke rather than that joke, that's good enough. The origin thing is unknowable usually.
I hate to say no more questions, but we
But
don't
no
have
more
this
questions.
room. But I'm going to say it. No more questions. I should say it 3 times.
Say it
What?
3, yeah.
I'm so confused. I can't thank you enough. This has been wonderful. I hope you'll be able to stay for a few minutes.
Yes,
in case
if
people
anybody
do
wants
have
to come up,
questions.
that's fine.
So
Sure.
Thank you very much.